Hi all, let's continue our look at the evolution of chess style and check out some of the more interesting games from the 1951 World Championship match between Mikhail Botvinnik and David Bronstein. So Bronstein, although he wasn't active very much in the years previous to this match, he had been compiling notes of relevance and ideas. Okay, so here in game 5, Botvinnik playing white kicks off with d4. David Bronstein played a Nimzo engine defense when it was allowed, because Botvinnik played knight c3. We have bishop b4, the Rubinstein variation e3, very popular still today. Black castled, bishop d3, and now c5, putting pressure on the white center. Knight f3, b6, with the idea of a quick fianchetto to put more pressure on that e4 square, which happens. Knight a4 with the threat of a3. Black releases some squares for the bishop, which is made use of now. White, though, is gaining some space on the queen side here. Queen c7 not only puts pressure on c4 but also h2, and we'll see that's important now after b4, because black now plays knight g4 eyeing h2, threatening bishop takes f3 and queen h2 checkmate. So g3 parries that and also supports bishop f4. It is a weakening, of course, on the light squares. f5, so if the knight retreats, it's not blocking that pawn, which can hold a bit more the e4 square here. Of course, there is a downside to this, that white can prepare to push through with d5. This structure is a bit more fragile. Against the d5 push, the knight retreats ominously, as though d5 is, to be taken seriously. Not only that, though, there's ideas of bishop f4, and if d6, knight b5 or c5. So actually a6 is played to stop at least knight b5 in some of the lines. So now also bishop f4 can be answered with bishop d6 without allowing knight b5, which would be embarrassing. We have rook e1, and it looks as though the d5 push, more power has been given to it. So classic play by Botvinnik, not too worried it seems by Black's flank attack. Knight c6, seemingly encouraging d5 provocatively, but trying to grab maybe the e5 square. If the knight can come to e5, then it's held there. So we see bishop f1 for the moment, and now actually knight d8, so the knight's coming to f7, bishop f4, bishop d6. With this exchange of dark square bishops, are these dark squares weaker for white or for black here? Black might be threatening at some point bishop takes f3, not with the loose rook, but at some point. But we see bishop g2 logically supporting that knight. Knight f7, c5 gaining space, rook c1. This looks like an embarrassing square for the queen. Now we have knight a4 challenging this b6 pawn. It moves forward, and again now d5 is on the cards. This seemingly thematic break against this pawn structure. f4, and we have d5. F takes. Now interestingly, you might think f takes was played rather than h takes. This provides sometimes more defensive resources, like using the f file if needed, if black ever is going to put pressure on f3 later. And also, given that white's got such a cramp on the queen side, this diagonal doesn't seem that relevant. Black hasn't got a dark square bishop to exploit these dark square weaknesses that easily, it seems. Now interestingly, after e takes d5, white didn't play knight takes d5. There are some tactical concerns though with rook takes e1, which could be quite worrying. The queen couldn't take as a bishop takes d5. If the knight takes, then there's some interesting possibilities perhaps. So instead we see queen d4, so it becomes a temporary pawn sack, blocking in this bishop though. Seems quite justified, keeping a grip, an iron grip on the dark squares, particularly e5. And also now the rooks are supporting each other, so any rook takes e1, the queen's not responsible for the rook on e1 here. So it seems all in all this is potentially quite dangerous, because if white can get this pawn, then this is a backward pawn, this is a strong protected pass pawn. We see now knight f6, knight h4, and now this pawn looks to be in grave danger, leaving white with an advantage. But we see rook e5 stubbornly defending that pawn, and also protecting, of course, the f5 square. That's taken, queen takes, the queen's come off here, knight f5, and now there's a threat of knight e7 check to try and get this pawn maybe with advantage. Knight c4 hitting a3 though, and also this knight's a bit loose, so white has to worry about this knight moving as well. We see rook d1 for the moment. At the moment there's always knight e7 check, so king goes to h8, at least getting rid of that possibility of the check. And yeah, it's tactically interesting how there could be a backfire on f1 in this position if white tries to win this pawn. There could be some horrible tactics involving g6 and knight e3 with an idea of rook f1 checkmate and some of the variations here. Just to show that, just imagine this position. Well, it doesn't even work anyway, because there's rook takes f5. Or does it? No, the rook's protecting the knight, but if we have g6, where does this knight go? If we have this position and the knight has to go somewhere here, then knight e3, and there's an embarrassing idea of rook f1 checkmate here. So there are some big pitfalls in this position, trying to grab this pawn after king h8. The dynamics here are interesting. It's not just about a3, this knight jumping into e3, this f file. The dynamics are quite interesting now. So we see rook e1, leaving black with that extra pawn for a moment longer. But now it's two pawns. But I know that they are diced. Knight d6 hitting the bishop goes to c6. Rook a1, white gets one of the pawns back. But now d4, this is a running pass pawn potentially. Knight c takes b5, bishop takes g2, weakening white on the light squares. And now knight g4, and there are vicious threats in the position involving the two knights and the rook all of a sudden. Knight f5, trying to defend things using the back row weakness. This cannot be taken as the back row mate. But here, David Bronstein is clearly in the driving seat in this position. Some key points about this position. If g6 actually, white doesn't play this just gets mated if he uses this knight to take on d4. It gets mated because there's knight e3 check, forcing the king to h3. If the king moves back, there's rook f1. And if the king is forced to h3 here, there's a crushing move. Can you see what black can play here, which is basically forcing mate in a few moves by force? Black to play in this position. What would you play with black here? Okay, you want to pause the video. g5, it threatens knight f2 checkmate, and if white tries to stop knight f2 checkmate, this is very embarrassing because the pawn is creating that mating there. If rook a2, then rook f6, and rook h6 now is difficult to stop. White will have to try and desperately give up material in some weird way just to stave off its mate coming after this check. Might be able to throw in a few more checks, but ultimately he's lost here. This is a beautiful mating net. So the cheeky point now about this knight f5 is that if d3 wasn't played, which is the strongest move in this position, if this less strong move is played, white does have a much better resource. Can you see what white can actually play instead of knight takes there? If I give you 5 seconds, white to play here. Stronger move is available here. Okay, knight b takes d4, and this is dangerous for black, and he's going to be losing his attack if he plays this, because we lose this knight, and where's the attack? Just block the f file. It's a pass pawn here, and also of course it's not as attractive to even lose the rook here, because this is still a dangerous pass pawn, etc. and yeah, you don't want that position. So this was actually a tricky defensive idea, but this pawn has come back to haunt Mikhail Botvinnik in this position. With d3, there's now an immediate d2 issue as well. So it's not just king, it's combining with this passed pawn here. So a very, very tricky position indeed. We see rook d6 trying to get behind that passed pawn, but dropping the knight here after rook takes d7. This is a disaster after knight ce3 check. The white king is actually getting mated in this position, echoing some previous lines. If king g1, rook f1 checkmate. If king h3, this is checkmate. It's mate both ways. Wherever the white king goes, it's checkmate. So white has to resign here. A disaster for Mikhail Botvinnik. What happened here? He temporarily sacked a pawn and never could seem to get it back. Black had enough dynamic play to threaten white's king in the variations. So this was the first very, very interesting game of the match. David Bronstein not having to rely on the Germans. That was one of the things he said about the match, that some of the games where there were Germans were usually the ones which Botvinnik won. But David Bronstein won this before move 40, basically, forcing checkmate here. A very, very interesting game. Hope you enjoyed it. Comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.